Hi, I'm Mr. Buckingham, and this video is on conservation biology and management. So this little turtle is the western pond turtle, and you can see by this graph, this figure, that it exists a lot on the western coast, and a lot of those populations are starting to decline, and it actually is listed in Oregon as a threatened species. So the Oregon Zoo is teaming up with other organizations in Oregon to try and rehabilitate some of those populations. So what they're doing is trying to incubate them and housing some of these turtles when they're babies so they get big enough so they cannot be eaten by bullfrogs. So bullfrogs are an incredibly invasive species, and they were brought over for pregnancy research, and they got loose in labs and started to inhabit some of the areas around here, and they eat everything, including little tiny turtles, which is a really sad thing. So a lot of researchers are trying to figure out what can we do to save some of the western pond turtles. And the research I'm doing right now with Portland State University, I'm going to be monitoring and observing some of those turtle populations up in North Portland and the wetland areas and seeing what they're doing during the summers. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how conservation biologists are trying to conserve some of the diversity of organisms. And there's two different terms: species diversity, which is different than species richness. And when those start to decline, we're going to have a loss of biodiversity. And it could mean that we're going to have a loss of species, we're going to have a loss of ecosystem diversity, and a loss of genetic diversity. And those three things together interplay some of the biodiversity themes. And then there are a few, actually not just a few, many current projects in Oregon, and I'm going to talk about one in particular that is trying to monitor and try and save some of the species in a localized area around Portland. So species richness means that there's going to be the presence of species in the area, or what is this presence of a species in the area. So plot A looks like it is going to have about a relatively even distribution of species. So it looks like about 25% of each species is in that area. Plot B has very different species richness, and it looks like there's one species that takes up about 75%, and the others are a lot, they're 10 to 5% in the area. So what does that mean for other organisms that rely on those type of trees? So the one that is bushy on top, what does that do? A lot of organisms rely on that, or do not as many organisms rely on that? And if that's the case, it could affect the ecosystem greatly. And then species diversity will mean that it's just the number of species in the area. So just a blanket number. So it looks like if we took a number, there's about 20 species in the area. Well, if we went out into the field and we counted the individuals of that species, then we could say, okay, well, there's a higher percentage or an equal percentage of all of these types of mushrooms in this area. Or is there one that outweighs the other? So maybe this weird flat looking mushroom might dominate that area. So the species richness will be high for that type of species. And so these frogs are an example of how we have biodiversity in an area. So some of these are poison dart frogs, and they will have different genes, and they will have different ecological niches, so their role that they play in the ecosystem. And it's really important that we conserve these, because without some of these, our ecosystems could collapse. So say in our Pacific Northwest ecosystem, and this is going to be the food web, we have Pacific tree frogs, also called chorus frogs. And if we were to eliminate those, or something happened and there's a disease that eliminated this frog, that means that a lot of the other species in this area could decline. So this pine marten, or this rabbit, even this raven, and that means that our entire ecosystem is affected, and we do not want that. So we can have other species that could fill that role. So say this other type of frog, this yellow one, which we do not have in the Pacific Northwest, if that one were to fill the role of the Pacific tree frog, then we wouldn't be in that bad of a problem. So we have species diversity. So we want to definitely conserve that. There's also ecosystem diversity, and we have many different types of ecosystem which are important to the health of our Earth. And another one, genetic diversity, is super important. So if we have different genes, so this is going to be DNA, and different sequences of our genetic code, that means that we could be resistant, or some of us could be resistant to different diseases. And when we see certain species that all have similar DNA, if something were to affect that population, then all of them can die. And that's when we get extinction events. And we need a certain population number in order to have a certain genetic diversity. So there is a project that I'm involved with PSU right now, and down in Wilsonville. And there is a huge development going in, and it's pretty much already built, and it is increasing the population of Wilsonville by about a third. And they are pretty large houses, and it's right next to this wetland, this large wetland, and it's bisected by this bridge, Buckman Road. And we want to see, is this development affecting some of the movement of certain species? So I am going to be monitoring some of the species and how they move from, let's do a different color, from this side of the wetland to the other side, and vice versa. And that is important so that those species share some of their genes, and we have a diversity of genes, and we're not starting to segregate those populations. And so what they did with that area is they started to divert some of the channels of this wetlands, of this little tiny stream, and slow it down, and they planted a lot of native grasses and native plants, and now it looks like this, and it's pretty lush, which is a good thing. So what we can see, we lay these sand, not traps, but sand pieces on the bottom or underneath this bridge. And what we do is we go back after a week and we check to see what tracks are there once these organisms walk across the sand. And what we found is actually it's quite a bit of biodiversity, so the different types of species. So this one is a long-toed salamander, so you can see its little tail mark here, and it undulates back and forth. It kind of goes back and forth, sideways to sideways. We've seen mule deer tracks. We've seen a chorus frog, which is also going to be the tree frog. We've seen raccoons. We've seen the western jumping mouse, and you can see its little tail marks here. And a long-toed weasel, tailed weasel, which is really fun to see. Banana slug, and banana slugs will leave this little slime trail. And American robins, so some of the other passerine species, or some of the songbird species are there, and they're hard to identify. I haven't been able to do that. Meadow vole, and that does not have a little tail mark. Garter snake, so you can see this line going up here, and you can tell which way it's going by how much it pushes the sand on one direction or not. And the common snipe, which is really fun to see that. So there are multiple different types of species. So some birds, some mammals, some reptiles, some amphibians, really cool. So there are other organizations, not just Portland State University, that are researching our area around Portland. So I'm with a team right now from PSU. We're working with Metro, which is the governing body of the Portland and surrounding areas. The Oregon Zoo is doing a lot of conservation biology type research, and they're incubating, and they're taking care of some of the baby turtles, which is really fun to see. Friends of Trees plants a lot of native and other types of trees around the area to increase the canopy size in the amount of canopy in our regions, in the cities, in order for other organisms to use as well, which is a great thing, and increase the health of our the clean air, which is really important. And then Audubon Society does many things. They do education. They have a wildlife care center that I used to work at for a little bit, and they used to rehabilitate some of the native species that have been injured. And it's not just birds; it can be all of the species that I previously listed. They'll take care of and put back into the wild once they have been rehabilitated. So if you're interested in getting into some of this work, you should check out some of these groups, and you can always volunteer with them. And sometimes you can even get a job, paying job, which is really fun. And that's it. Thanks for watching.